You know how they say truckers see the weirdest stuff on the road? I used to think it was just tall tales to pass the time during long hauls. That was before I started driving myself and stumbled into something I'll never be able to forget. It started on a lonely stretch of Highway 191, cutting through the Utah desert. Midnight had come and gone, and the moon cast long shadows over the jagged rocks. I was hauling a full load of canned goods, my destination a warehouse outside of Phoenix. The company didn't pay me to stop, so I had one rule: keep the wheels turning. I'd been driving for 6 hours straight when I saw it. Red taillights blinking up ahead. A pickup truck was parked on the shoulder, hazards flashing in the pitch-black night. Normally, I wouldn't stop. Too many stories about drivers getting jumped or worse. But something about the scene didn't sit right. There was no movement, no silhouette of a person waving for help. Just those lights blinking like a heartbeat. I slowed to a crawl, scanning the truck as I passed. The driver's side door was wide open. A pair of boots sat neatly on the ground beside the truck, toes pointing outward. No sign of the driver. No luggage. Nothing. I told myself to keep going, but a few miles down the road, a feeling clawed at the back of my mind. What if someone was hurt out there? I couldn't just leave them stranded. Against my better judgment, I pulled over and grabbed my flashlight. I stepped out of my rig, the cool desert air biting at my skin. Everything was
Before I continue, my friends, I kindly ask you to subscribe to my channel. It only takes a second for you, but it's a huge boost of motivation for me to keep creating videos. I'd also greatly appreciate your comments. Thank you for your support. Now, let's get back to the story.
No keys in the ignition, no phone charging on the dash. Just a single Polaroid photo tucked into the sun visor. I hesitated but reached for it. The image showed a man in his late 30s, smiling awkwardly in front of what looked like a family camper. His face was familiar in a vague, déjà vu kind of way, but I couldn't place him. Scrawled across the bottom of the photo in faded ink were the words, "They follow." My stomach tightened. I turned and aimed the flashlight at the ground, scanning for footprints. There were none. Not in the loose dirt, not in the gravel shoulder. It was as if the boots had been dropped from the sky. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. That's when I noticed it. A faint sound, so subtle I thought I'd imagined it at first, like breathing but not quite. A low, rhythmic hiss coming from somewhere behind me. I spun around, the beam of my flashlight darting wildly across the road. There was nothing, just the empty highway stretching into oblivion. The sound had stopped, but my heart was pounding, and I suddenly felt exposed, like I was being watched. I decided I'd seen enough. My instinct screamed at me to leave, and I wasn't about to argue. I turned back toward my truck, quickening my pace. When the hiss returned, closer this time, I froze. The sound was coming from directly behind me. Every fiber of my being told me not to turn around, but curiosity, no fear, forced my hand. I slowly pivoted, my flashlight trembling in my grip. At first, I saw nothing but empty road and blackness. Then, just beyond the edge of the flashlight's reach, something moved. A shadow, low to the ground, slithering across the asphalt. My flashlight flicked upward, catching a brief glimpse of a figure crouched on all fours. It was human but not. Its limbs were too long, bending unnaturally, its head tilted as if studying me. The thing's eyes reflected the light like an animal's, two glowing orbs that locked onto mine. "Who's there?" I managed to stammer, my voice cracking. The thing didn't answer. Instead, it crawled closer, its movements jerky and insect-like. My legs screamed for me to run, but I couldn't move. My body was locked in place as the thing rose to its full height, towering over me. Then it spoke. Its voice was low and gravelly, like gravel being ground under a tire. "You have followed them, too." I didn't have time to ask what it meant before the thing lunged. My survival instincts kicked in, and I bolted toward my truck, legs pumping harder than they ever had. I could hear it behind me, its steps uneven but fast, too fast. I reached my truck and threw myself into the cab, slamming the door shut and locking it in one frantic motion. My hands fumbled for the ignition, but my truck wouldn't start. No, 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 I screamed, pounding the steering wheel. Outside, the creature stood in the middle of the road, staring at me, his head tilted to one side, almost curious. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it retreated, loping back toward the abandoned pickup. It crouched beside the boots, its long fingers tracing the leather with what looked like reverence. My truck roared to life, and I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I slammed the gas pedal, tires screeching as I peeled away. I drove like a maniac, the high beams cutting through the emptiness of the desert highway. My hands shook as I gripped the wheel, glancing nervously in the mirrors. My mind was racing. What had I just seen? After about 10 miles, my heart rate started to settle, though every shadow along the roadside seemed to twist into shapes that weren't there. I convinced myself I was in the clear. Whatever that thing was, it had stayed back with the pickup. Then I noticed the smell. It started faint, an acrid metallic scent that wafted through the vents. At first, I thought it was something burning under the hood, but as it grew stronger, filling the cab, I realized it smelled like rust. No blood. I gagged and cranked the windows down, letting the cool desert air rush in. That's when I saw it. The Polaroid. It was lying on the passenger seat. I knew I'd left it behind in the pickup. My stomach dropped as I picked it up, hoping my eyes were playing tricks on me. But it was different now. The same man stood in the frame, but his face wasn't smiling anymore. His mouth hung slack, eyes wide with terror. Behind him, barely visible in the shadows, was the thing I'd seen crouching in the road. My truck's headlights flickered, and the engine sputtered. No, 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 I yelled, slamming the dashboard. The lights went out entirely, plunging me into darkness as the truck coasted to a stop. The only sound was the wind howling outside. I reached for my phone, fumbling to turn on the flashlight, but before I could, the cab filled with that same hiss from earlier. This time, it came from all around me. Something heavy slammed against the side of the truck, hard enough to rock the cab. Then again, on the other side, I could hear scratching, long, deliberate drags of claws across metal. In a panic, I grabbed the tire iron I kept under the seat and yanked the door open, stepping into the night. My flashlight darted over the highway, the empty desert beyond, but nothing was there. The noises stopped. Then, just on the edge of my vision, I saw them. Figures, dozens of them, crouched low and moving toward me. Their glowing eyes blinked in unison, reflecting the moonlight like animal predators. I clambered back into the cab, slamming the door and locking it again. The truck's engine was dead, but I didn't care. I wasn't leaving this cab. The figures encircled me, their movements jerky and inhuman. One of them stood taller than the rest, stepping closer to the windshield. Its face was obscured, but I could feel its eyes boring into me. It raised a long, bony hand and pointed toward the road ahead. Then, it spoke in that same gravelly voice, "Keep driving." My hands trembled as I sat frozen in the cab. The figure outside didn't move, its outstretched finger pointing toward the road like a grim directive. The others circled the truck, their glowing eyes fixed on me, unblinking. My mind raced. My truck was dead, surrounded, and there was no way out. Yet that voice, it was a command, not a threat. Keep driving. Desperate, I turned the key again, silently praying. The engine coughed, sputtered, and roared to life. The figures froze, their heads snapping toward the truck. For a moment, everything felt suspended, as if time itself had hesitated. I slammed the gas pedal, and the truck lurched forward. The headlights blazed, cutting through the figures as they scattered into the darkness. I felt the tires bump over something. A log, I told myself, not daring to look in the mirrors. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, a narrow line between the desolation on either side. The smell of blood faded, replaced by the cold, clean bite of the desert air streaming through the windows. I kept my eyes forward, refusing to look into the night. But the figures didn't leave me. Every so often, I caught glimpses of them on the periphery. Just beyond the reach of the headlights, shapes moved, keeping pace with the truck. Their eyes glinted like embers, appearing and vanishing as I sped through the night. Then, far in the distance, I saw it. A single light blinking in the darkness. A gas station. Civilization. Hope. I gunned it, the truck roaring as it hurtled toward the light. My chest tightened as I closed the distance, expecting the figures to stop me, to block the road. But they didn't. They just watched, their glowing eyes receding into the shadows. I screeched into the station, slamming on the brakes and parking under the floodlights. For the first time, I felt safe. The clerk inside stared at me as I stumbled through the door, disheveled and pale. "You okay, buddy?" he asked, eyeing me warily. I wanted to tell him everything, but where would I even begin? Instead, I muttered something about a breakdown and asked for coffee. As he poured, I glanced outside. The highway was empty. I stayed in that gas station until sunrise, not daring to return to the truck until the sun was high in the sky. When I finally stepped out, the desert seemed ordinary again, harmless. But as I climbed into my rig, I froze. Sitting on the dashboard where the Polaroid had been was a new photo. It showed me, sitting in the cab, my face pale with terror. And behind me, barely visible in the darkened sleeper compartment, were two glowing eyes. I don't drive that route anymore. Hell, I barely drive at night. I don't know what I saw out there, and I'm not sure I want to know. But if you're ever out on Highway 191, and you see an abandoned truck with its hazards on, keep driving. In the weeks that followed, Martha adjusted to the silence of the house. It was eerie at first, the absence of Robert's steady presence unsettling. She wasn't sure what she missed more, the man she thought she knew or the comforting illusion of stability he'd provided. Her days became a whirlwind of logistics. Contacting lawyers, freezing joint accounts, and securing her financial independence. Robert had left her a note, scrawled in his familiar handwriting, apologizing for his mistakes. But there was no explanation that could soften what he'd done. One afternoon, as she sifted through documents, a letter arrived addressed to her. The handwriting was unfamiliar, bold and precise. The return address was from a law firm in Florida. Puzzled, she tore it open. Inside was a formal statement informing her of Robert's involvement in a pending criminal investigation. The letter alleged that under the alias James Harlow, he had laundered money for a series of offshore accounts tied to illegal dealings. The details were vague, but the consequences were stark. The authorities were building a case, and they needed Martha's cooperation. Her hands trembled as she set the letter down. This wasn't just infidelity. It wasn't just lies. Robert had been involved in something far darker than she'd imagined. She called the investigator she had hired earlier. "I need you to dig deeper," she said, her voice firm. "I need to know everything." Days later, the investigator returned with more than Martha had bargained for. Robert, under his alias, had been connected to a shady network of businesses funneling cash through shell companies. What appeared on the surface to be small investments in real estate or startups were fronts for laundering funds tied to smuggling operations abroad. One name kept surfacing in the reports: Anna. She wasn't just a fleeting affair. She had been Robert's partner in crime. The villa Martha had seen in the photo? It was used to host secret meetings. But Anna had disappeared years ago. Some speculated she had fled. Others whispered she had been silenced. Martha couldn't reconcile this version of Robert with the man she had known, the man who watered their lawn every morning and counted pennies from their coupons. Yet the evidence was irrefutable. As the investigation deepened, law enforcement agents visited her home. They asked probing questions about Robert's habits, his accounts, and his recent whereabouts. Martha answered cautiously, torn between a lingering loyalty and a growing desire for justice. One question chilled her to the core. "Has your husband been in contact with you since he left?" He hadn't. But that night, as she lay awake in bed, her phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. She hesitated before answering. "Martha," came Robert's voice, low and urgent. "You need to stop. You don't know what you're getting into." "Don't I?" she shot back, her anger finally spilling over. "You lied to me. You betrayed me. You used me. I was protecting you." Robert insisted. You don't understand, these people don't play by the rules. If you keep digging, they'll come after you. Is that a threat? She demanded. No, he said, his voice breaking. It's a warning. Let it go. But Martha couldn't. Something inside her had shifted, a resolve she never knew she possessed. For years, she had been the quiet, accommodating wife. Now, she was determined to uncover the full extent of his deceit, no matter the risk. The next day, she met with law enforcement again. This time, she handed over everything she had, including the recording of Robert's call. If he's guilty, she said, her voice steady, I want him to pay for what he's done. Martha knew she was stepping into dangerous territory, but there was no turning back. The man she had loved was gone, replaced by a shadow she barely recognized. What remained was her quest for the truth, even if it meant unraveling the life she had spent decades building. Martha's cooperation with the authorities triggered a cascade of events she couldn't have anticipated. The FBI now considered her a key witness. They placed her under temporary protection, installing surveillance around her home and advising her to limit her movements. For the first time in her life, Martha felt unsafe in her own skin. The tension heightened one evening when she noticed a dark sedan parked down the street. It had been there for hours, engine idling, windows tinted too dark to see through. She called her FBI contact, a sharp-eyed agent named Daniels, who promised to investigate. Daniels arrived within minutes, his demeanor calm but alert. He approached the vehicle cautiously, speaking into his radio. Moments later, the car peeled away, tires screeching. Daniels returned to Martha, his expression grim. Do you recognize anyone who might want to intimidate you? He asked. Martha shook her head. Besides Robert? No. Daniels frowned. This isn't just intimidation, Mrs. Green. Whoever's watching you isn't trying to scare you. They're gathering information. Stay vigilant. A week later, Martha was called to a secure federal building to testify in a preliminary hearing. The evidence against Robert, and by extension James Harlow, was damning. Financial trails meticulously tied him to illicit networks, and now Martha's testimony about his double life added a personal layer to the narrative. But what shook her most was what she learned during the proceedings. Anna, the woman she had thought to be Robert's lover and accomplice, wasn't just missing. She was presumed dead. Authorities believed Robert was involved in her disappearance. The villa, once a romantic backdrop in her nightmares, was suspected of being a crime scene. Sitting in the sterile courtroom, Martha felt her world crumble anew. Had her husband, a man who once cried during a neighbor's funeral, taken a life? When the prosecutor finished presenting the evidence, Martha faced an unexpected question. Mrs. Green, in your opinion, was your husband capable of violence? Her pulse quickened. She thought of his outbursts, rare but sharp, like a storm breaking the monotony of his otherwise placid demeanor. She remembered the way he had dismissed arguments with a cold finality, shutting down conversations he didn't want to have. And now, she recalled his warning over the phone, the tension in his voice not just fear but desperation. Yes, she said quietly, her voice breaking. I think he was. The revelation didn't just haunt her. It placed her squarely in the crosshairs of a tangled web. Within days of her testimony, Martha found a letter slipped under her door. It was handwritten, its tone chillingly familiar. Asterisk, stop talking. You're in over your head. Asterisk, there was no signature, but she knew the handwriting. It was Robert's. Panicked, she contacted Daniels, who increased her protection detail. He's trying to silence me, she said, clutching the note. But I won't let him. Daniels nodded. If he's reaching out, it means he's desperate. And desperate men make mistakes. Martha wasn't sure whether that comforted her or terrified her more. She resolved to stay strong, to see this through to the end. For once, she wouldn't be the accommodating partner. She would fight for the truth, no matter the cost. Weeks passed, and the net around Robert tightened. Authorities tracked his movements to a secluded cabin in upstate New York. A raid was planned, but Robert wasn't there when they arrived. Instead, they found a trove of incriminating evidence. Burner phones, fake passports, and documents detailing money transfers and coded messages. But one item stopped the agents in their tracks, a list. At the top was Martha's name, circled in red. When Daniels delivered the news, Martha felt her blood run cold. "He's targeting me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "We believe so," Daniels said grimly. "But we're going to stop him." Despite their assurances, Martha couldn't shake the feeling that Robert, James, was always one step ahead. The man she had shared her life with was gone, replaced by someone ruthless, calculating, and willing to destroy anyone in his path. As the hunt for Robert continued, Martha made a decision. She wouldn't hide in fear. If her husband wanted to confront her, she would face him. This time she would be ready. The night was heavy with silence when Martha finally decided to take matters into her own hands. Weeks of waiting for Robert's capture had pushed her to the edge. She couldn't live like a hunted animal anymore. If he wanted to come for her, she would meet him on her terms, not as the timid wife he once knew, but as someone who had been forged in the fire of his betrayals. Martha packed a bag with essentials: a flashlight, her phone, and a small revolver she had purchased discreetly after the list with her name was discovered. She had never handled a gun before, but Daniels had insisted on giving her basic training. His final words rang in her ears. Asterisk, don't use it unless you're absolutely certain you're in danger. And if you do, don't hesitate. Asterisk, she wasn't looking for a fight. She was looking for answers. Martha drove through the night, her destination clear in her mind. The villa. She had pieced together its location from the investigator's notes and photos. If Robert had fled somewhere, she believed it would be there. The villa had been the epicenter of his secret life, the place where James Harlow had flourished. It seemed fitting that it might also be his final refuge. The villa stood on a cliff overlooking the ocean, its once bright facade now weathered and forlorn. Vines crept along the walls, and the windows were dark. Martha parked her car at a distance and approached on foot, her every step crunching against the gravel path. The air smelled of salt and decay. She hesitated at the front door, her hand trembling as she reached for the knob. It turned easily, creaking open to reveal a dimly lit interior. The villa was eerily quiet, the shadows stretching long across the floor. "Robert?" she called out, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her chest. "I know you're here." Her words echoed, met only by the sound of distant waves crashing against the rocks. She stepped inside, her flashlight sweeping the room. Dust covered the furniture, and cobwebs hung in the corners. But then, in the kitchen, she spotted something fresh. A coffee mug on the counter, a faint ring of liquid at the bottom. He had been here recently. Martha moved cautiously through the villa, her hand hovering near the revolver in her bag. She climbed the creaking staircase to the second floor, her heart pounding with every step. At the end of the hallway was a door slightly ajar, a faint light spilling out. She pushed the door open, and there he was. Robert sat at a desk, his back to her, his figure outlined by the glow of a single lamp. He didn't turn as she entered, as if he had been expecting her all along. "So, you found me," he said quietly, his voice devoid of the warmth she once knew. "I didn't have a choice," she replied, her voice sharp. "You made sure of that." Robert turned slowly, his face worn and hollow. He looked older, as though the weight of his secrets had finally caught up to him. "I warned you, Martha. You should have stayed out of this." "Out of what?" she snapped, stepping closer. "Out of the lies? The crimes? The betrayal? You destroyed everything we built together. And for what?" "For survival," he said simply. "James Harlow wasn't just a name. It was my way out of a life I couldn't stand. But you were never supposed to be part of this." "Well, now I am," she said, her hand tightening around the revolver. "And you're going to tell me everything." Robert's expression darkened. "Do you really think you can handle the truth? You don't know the people I've crossed, the things I've done. If you keep pushing, they'll come for you too. This isn't a game, Martha." "Then stop playing it," she said, pulling the revolver from her bag. "End it here. Tell me the truth." For a moment, he stared at the weapon, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. Then he laughed softly. You always were stronger than I gave you credit for. He stood slowly, his hands raised. Fine. You want the truth? Anna wasn't just my partner. She was my undoing. She was working with the same people I was trying to escape. When I found out, I confronted her. Things got out of hand. You killed her, Martha said, her voice a whisper. Robert's silence confirmed it. And now they're after you, she continued, piecing it together. Because you took their money, their trust. Because you're a coward. Robert's jaw tightened. You don't understand. No, I do, she interrupted, the barrel of the revolver steady in her hands. You're not a victim, Robert. You're a monster. Before he could respond, the sound of tires crunching outside froze them both. Headlights swept across the room, and Robert's face paled. They're here, he whispered. Martha turned toward the window and saw two black SUVs pull up, men in dark suits stepping out with weapons drawn. Her grip on the revolver tightened as she turned back to Robert. What do we do now? She demanded. Robert looked at her, a glimmer of the man she once loved shining through the cracks of his facade. We survive. Together. But Martha wasn't sure she believed him anymore. Martha didn't lower the gun, even as the sound of heavy footsteps echoed from outside. Her mind raced. The men were closing in, and her instinct screamed that trusting Robert again could be the last mistake she'd ever make. Robert moved toward the window, peering through the blinds. They're professionals, he muttered. They won't leave witnesses. Then why are you so calm? Martha shot back, keeping the revolver aimed at him. He turned to her, a grim smile tugging at his lips. Because I've spent years planning for this moment. Before she could respond, Robert reached under the desk and pressed a hidden button. A faint click echoed from somewhere in the room, followed by the sound of machinery. The bookshelf along the far wall slid open, revealing a narrow passageway. Martha's jaw clenched. You had an escape route this whole time? I built this villa for James Harlow, Robert said, his voice calm. And James Harlow always plans ahead. The pounding on the front door began, heavy and deliberate. Martha glanced between Robert and the passageway, her indecision mounting. Why should I go with you? How do I know this isn't another one of your lies? You don't, he said simply. But if you stay, you die. Your choice. Martha's anger flared, but the sound of wood splintering downstairs left little room for debate. She stepped toward the passageway, keeping the gun trained on Robert. You go first. Robert hesitated, then nodded. He ducked into the dark tunnel, and Martha followed, her flashlight cutting through the gloom. The air was damp and cold, the passageway sloping downward. Behind her, she heard the unmistakable crash of the front door giving way. The passage twisted and turned, finally opening into a cavernous space that led to the cliffs. A boat bobbed in the water below, tied to a rickety wooden dock. Robert gestured toward it. That's our way out. But Martha wasn't ready to let him off the hook. You're not running from them. You're running from me. Robert sighed, turning to face her. Martha, if I wanted to hurt you, I could have done it 100 times by now. I've made mistakes, terrible ones, but right now, survival is the only thing that matters. Survival for you, she snapped. Not for Anna. Not for anyone else you betrayed. His eyes darkened. Anna made her choices, just like you're making yours now. Before she could respond, a gunshot rang out behind them. The sound reverberated through the tunnel, and Robert grabbed Martha's arm, dragging her toward the dock. There's no time. Another shot rang out, closer this time. The men had found the passageway. Martha broke free of Robert's grip. You go. I'm staying. His face twisted in confusion. What are you talking about? I'm not running from this, she said, raising the revolver. I'm not running from you. If they catch me, I'll tell them everything. Robert stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then, for the first time, he seemed genuinely afraid. Martha, if they know what you know, they won't just kill you. They'll make it slow. You're safer with me. I'd rather face them than live another second trusting you, she said coldly. The tunnel filled with shouts and footsteps. Robert hesitated for a moment longer, then turned and sprinted toward the boat. Martha watched him untie it and start the engine, the roar of the motor drowning out the chaos behind her. She stood firm, her revolver at the ready, as the men rounded the corner. "Drop the weapon!" one of them barked, his gun trained on her. Martha complied, letting the revolver clatter to the ground. Her hands trembled, but her voice was steady. "I know everything about James Harlow, and I'm willing to talk." The men exchanged glances, then one stepped forward, lowering his weapon slightly. "Smart choice, lady. Come with us." As they led her out of the passageway, she caught a glimpse of the boat disappearing into the horizon. Robert was gone, his fate uncertain. But for the first time, she felt free, not from danger, but from the lies that had bound her for decades. Martha had chosen her path, and now she would fight for the truth no matter what it cost. Martha sat in the back of the black SUV, her wrists bound with plastic cuffs. The men who had captured her were silent, their faces hard and impassive. They weren't law enforcement. That much was clear from their rough handling and lack of badges. These were hired guns, the kind of men who dealt in fear and blood. The vehicle sped down a winding coastal road. Martha's mind raced as she calculated her options. She had no weapon, no allies, and no way to know where they were taking her. But she still had one advantage, her knowledge. Robert had always underestimated her, and she hoped these men would make the same mistake. The SUV finally came to a stop outside a dilapidated warehouse near the docks. The air reeked of salt water and oil. One of the men yanked the door open and pulled her out roughly. "Move!" he barked, shoving her toward the entrance. Inside, the warehouse was dimly lit, its cavernous space filled with rusting machinery and scattered crates. A man stood waiting in the center of the room, flanked by two more armed guards. He was tall and lean, his tailored suit a stark contrast to the grime around him. His face was sharp, his eyes cold. "Mrs. Green," he said, his voice smooth and controlled. "I was hoping we'd meet." Martha held his gaze, refusing to show fear. "Who are you?" The man smiled faintly. "Call me Vincent. I represent the interests that your husband, or rather James Harlow, betrayed." She stiffened. "If you're looking for him, he's gone. Took a boat and disappeared. I stayed to face you." Vincent tilted his head, studying her. "Brave, or foolish, but you're lying. You've helped him escape before, haven't you? You've been complicit in his crimes." "I didn't know," she said firmly. "Not until it was too late. I've been as much a victim as anyone else." Vincent's smile vanished. "Victim or not, you know things that could be useful to me." He motioned to one of the guards, who placed a chair behind her and shoved her into it. "Let's make a deal, Mrs. Green. You tell me everything about James Harlow, his contacts, his plans, where he might go, and I'll consider letting you walk out of here alive." Martha hesitated, her mind spinning. She had no loyalty left for Robert, but she also knew these men wouldn't stop at her. If they caught him, they'd kill him, and not quickly. A part of her still wrestled with the memory of the man she had loved, even if he was long gone. "I'll tell you what I know," she said carefully, "but I want something in return." Vincent raised an eyebrow. "You're in no position to negotiate." "Maybe not," she said, meeting his gaze. "But if you kill me, you lose whatever information I have. I'll tell you what Robert told me. But I want protection. Witness protection, new identity, far away from all of this." Vincent smirked. "You think you're that valuable? Your men dragged me here instead of killing me outright," she countered. "You clearly think I am." He regarded her in silence, his eyes narrowing. Then he nodded slightly. "Start talking." Martha took a deep breath. She told him about the villa, the offshore accounts, the aliases she had discovered. She gave them enough to keep them busy, enough to make her seem cooperative, but not enough to give Robert away completely. It was a dangerous gamble, but she knew she had to play it carefully. Vincent listened intently, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he stood and motioned to his guards. "Take her to the car. We'll see if her information checks out." One of the guards grabbed her arm and pulled her to her feet. As they walked back to the SUV, Martha felt the weight of her decision pressing down on her. She had bought herself time, but for how long? Back at the villa, Robert's boat drifted along the open water. He was miles from the shore, but his mind was far from at ease. The darkness around him was oppressive, broken only by the faint hum of the engine. He knew Martha had made her choice, and for the first time he felt truly alone. But he wasn't out of moves yet. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a satellite phone. Dialing a number from memory, he waited until a familiar voice answered on the other end. "Is it done?" the voice asked. "Not yet," Robert replied, his tone calm. "But I have a plan. And Martha, she'll play her part perfectly." Far from the safety she thought she had secured, Martha's unwitting involvement in Robert's schemes was far from over. Martha sat in the darkened room of the safe house Vincent's men had relocated her to. The four walls felt more like a prison than protection, and the silence pressed heavily on her chest. She had given Vincent just enough information to keep herself alive, but she knew the clock was ticking. They would soon realize she had withheld key details about Robert's escape. Her mind churned with uncertainty. Robert's words lingered in her memory. Asterisk, "You're safer with me." Asterisk, she had dismissed him, but now she wasn't so sure. Vincent and his men were ruthless, but Robert, James, was cunning. He always had a plan, and Martha suspected that even now, he was playing a long game that involved her. A sudden knock on the door jolted her from her thoughts. One of Vincent's guards entered, his expression grim. "Vincent wants you," he said curtly. Martha followed him down the hallway, her pulse racing. She was led into a sparsely furnished room where Vincent waited. His face was a mask of cold calculation, but his tone was laced with irritation. "Mrs. Green," he began, gesturing for her to sit. "It seems the information you provided was incomplete." She braced herself. "I told you everything I know." Vincent leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Don't insult my intelligence. The villa was abandoned, the offshore accounts drained. Harlow is always 2 steps ahead, but I'm starting to think you're helping him stay there." "I'm not," she said firmly, though her voice wavered slightly. "I'm just as much a victim of his lies as you are." Vincent's lips curled into a humorless smile. "A victim, you say? Yet here you are, alive, while my employers have lost millions and trusted allies. Why is that, do you think?" Before she could answer, the door burst open, and one of Vincent's men hurried in, holding a phone. "Sir, you need to hear this." Vincent snatched the phone and listened, his expression darkening. After a moment, he handed the device to Martha. "It's for you." She hesitated, then placed the phone to her ear. "Hello. Hello, Martha." Robert's voice drawled, calm and confident. "I told you they'd come for you, and I told you to trust me." Her breath caught. "Robert, what are you doing?" "What I always do," he replied. "Cleaning up my messes. Vincent and his crew are on borrowed time. I gave them enough to keep you safe, leads they'll chase into dead ends. But now, it's time for you to come with me." "Come with you?" she said, anger flaring. "You've destroyed my life. You've made me a target. And I'll make you disappear," he said. "You want a new life? I can give you one, but you have to trust me." Vincent grabbed the phone from her hand, barking into it. "Where are you, Harlow?" Robert chuckled. "Closer than you think." At that moment, the building shook with a thunderous explosion. The lights flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. Chaos erupted as Vincent's men shouted orders, their voices drowned out by the blare of alarms. Martha ducked instinctively as the sound of gunfire rang out in the distance. Vincent grabbed her arm roughly, his voice a snarl. "This is your doing." "It's not," she shouted, yanking herself free. But she knew the truth. This was Robert's work. Somehow he had orchestrated the chaos, and she was still a pawn in his game. A guard burst into the room, blood staining his shirt. "We're under attack, multiple shooters." We need to evacuate. Vincent cursed, dragging Martha toward the exit. As they reached the hallway, another explosion shook the building, and smoke began to fill the air. In the chaos, Martha saw her chance. She elbowed Vincent in the ribs and broke free, darting into the smoke-filled corridor. She ran blindly, her lungs burning, until a hand grabbed her from the shadows. She screamed, struggling, until she heard his voice. "It's me," Robert said, pulling her close. "We have to move." She wanted to scream at him, to curse him, but survival overruled anger. She followed him out a side exit, where a black SUV idled. He shoved her inside and jumped into the driver's seat, flooring the accelerator as bullets pinged off the metal. They drove in silence for miles, the chaos of the ambush fading into the distance. Finally, Martha found her voice. "Why, Robert? Why drag me into this?" He glanced at her, his face weary but resolute. "Because you're the only thing I have left." His words cut her deeply, but she refused to let him see. "And what am I supposed to do now? Live as your hostage?" "No," he said, his tone softening. "Live free. The deal I struck with Vincent's people ensures they won't come after you. But we can't go back, Martha. Not to our old lives. Not to who we were." She stared out the window, the weight of his words sinking in. For years, she had lived in the shadow of his lies, and now, even with the truth laid bare, her path was no clearer. "Where are we going?" she asked finally. "Somewhere no one can find us," Robert replied. "A fresh start." She didn't respond, her silence heavy with uncertainty. As the SUV sped into the night, she realized she was no longer the woman she had been. Trust was a foreign concept now, and the man beside her, her husband, her betrayer, her savior, was a stranger she might never understand. And yet, in that moment, she had no choice but to follow him into the unknown.